Have you ever wondered what it truly means to be loyal? I mean really loyal. When everything you've ever believed in demands that you betray the person you love most in this world. Imagine for a moment that you're living in a society where the walls have ears, where your neighbor could be watching you, where your closest friend might be taking notes on everything you say. And now imagine that the person who turns you in, the person who destroys your entire life with a single phone call, is the woman who brought you into this world. Your own mother. This isn't fiction. This isn't some dystopian nightmare dreamed up by a novelist. This is a true story of how one mother in the Soviet Union made a choice that will haunt her for the rest of her life. And I need to tell you right now that by the time we reach the end of this story, you're going to question everything you thought you knew about loyalty, about love, about what any of us would actually do when faced with an impossible decision. So let me take you back to a time when fear wasn't just an emotion but a constant companion. A time when the KGB wasn't just a secret police force, but an invisible hand that reached into every kitchen, every bedroom, every whispered conversation between a mother and her son. And I want you to ask yourself as we go through this together, what would you do? Seriously, what would you do if the state you were raised to worship told you that your own child was a traitor? Would you protect them? Would you lie for them? Would you risk everything, including your own life and the lives of your other children? Or would you pick up that phone and make the call that would send them to prison or worse? Because that's exactly what happened in the story, and the woman at the center of it all wasn't some monster. She wasn't evil. She was just like millions of other Soviet citizens who grew up believing that the party was infallible, that the state was more important than any individual, even your own flesh and blood. And here's what makes this story so devastating, so important for you to hear all the way through. She thought she was doing the right thing. She genuinely believed that by turning in her son, she was saving him, saving her family, saving her country. And by the time she realized the magnitude of what she had done, it was too late. The machinery of the Soviet state had already consumed him, and all she was left with was guilt, isolation, and the knowledge that she had committed the ultimate betrayal. So stay with me, because I'm going to show you exactly how this happened, how a loving mother became an informant, how a system can corrupt even the purest intentions, and why this story matters just as much today as it did during the darkest days of the Cold War. Because the question at the heart of this tragedy isn't just about one woman or one son. It's about all of us. It's about the choices we make when we're terrified, when we're indoctrinated, when we're trapped between love and ideology. And I promise you that by the end, you'll understand why this story has haunted historians, psychologists, and moral philosophers for decades. I watched as my son changed right before my eyes, and at first I told myself it was nothing, just a natural curiosity of a young man discovering the world. But deep down I knew something fundamental was shifting in him, something dangerous. And it started so innocently, so gradually, with a book, just one book that someone had passed to him at the university, a copy of something typed on thin paper with smudged letters that looked like it had been read by 100 hands before his. And when I asked him what he was reading, he smiled at me with that smile I'd known since he was a child. And he said it was nothing, Mama, just poetry. But I could see in his eyes that it wasn't nothing, it was everything. And soon there were more books, more thin sheets of paper hidden under his mattress, stuffed behind a radiator, tucked inside the covers of approved Soviet texts. And I recognized some of the names whispered in our kitchen late at night, when he thought I was asleep. Pasternak, Solzhenitsyn, Bulgakov. Names that were supposed to be forgotten, erased, names that could get you arrested just for speaking them out loud. And I want you to understand something. I want you to really understand what it meant to possess these Samizdat materials in the Soviet Union. Because this wasn't like downloading a banned book on your computer or watching a censored video. This was physical evidence. This was proof that could be traced back through every single person who had touched those pages in the KGB. They had samples of every typewriter in every official publishing house and print shop. They could trace these documents. They could find the source. And everyone in that chain could be arrested, could disappear into the gulag system that Solzhenitsyn himself had written about in the very pages my son was reading. So imagine my fear. Imagine what it felt like to be a mother who knew that every night her son spent reading those forbidden words was a night he could be taken from me. And then came the meetings, the secret gatherings he thought I didn't know about, young people crowding into tiny apartments where they would discuss ideas that contradicted everything we'd been taught, everything the party had promised us. And my son started asking questions at dinner, dangerous questions about why certain books were banned, why certain histories were rewritten, why people disappeared and were never mentioned again. And I would tell him to be quiet, to stop talking. Like that, because in the Soviet Union, even your own walls could be listening. And here's what you need to understand about that time, about what it did to families. It created this terrible divide between those who believed and those who questioned, between those who feared and those who thought they were brave enough to resist. And I watched my son cross that line. I watched him transform from a good Soviet boy who I thought would have a safe future into someone who met with other dissidents, who copied and distributed these dangerous texts, who listened to foreign radio broadcasts from the BBC and Voice of America that were being jammed by massive Soviet equipment. And every time he left the house, I wondered if he would come back. Every time there was a knock on the door, my heart stopped, because I knew that possession of even a single manuscript could result in a visit from KGB. And what kind of visit would that be? What would they do to him? Would they send him to a psychiatric hospital where they drug dissidents into submission? Would they sentence him to hard labor in the camps? Would they simply make him disappear like so many others had disappeared? And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was watching him become more convinced, more passionate, more certain that what he was doing was right, that standing up for truth and freedom of expression was worth the risk. And I wanted to shake him. I wanted to scream at him that he was going to destroy not just himself, but our entire family, because that's how it worked. When one person was arrested for anti-Soviet activities, their whole family became suspect. Their whole family could lose their jobs, their housing, their place in society. And I could see it happening already. The way our neighbors started looking at us differently, the way conversations would stop when I entered the room at work, the way my son's friends would come to our apartment late at night and speak in hushed voices about things I didn't want to hear, about protests and petitions and open letters to government. And I tried to reason with him. I tried to explain that the system was too big, too powerful, that one person couldn't change anything, that all he would accomplish was his own destruction. But he looked at me with such disappointment, such sadness, and he said, "Mama, if everyone thinks like that, then nothing will ever change." And in that moment, I realized I had lost him, not to the KGB, not yet, but to an idea, to a belief that was stronger than his fear, stronger than his love for me, stronger than his sense of self-preservation. And the tension in our home became unbearable, every conversation a minefield, every disagreement a potential betrayal. Because I knew things about him now. I knew where he went, who he met with, what forbidden materials he possessed, and that knowledge was like a weight pressing down on my chest every single day. And you have to understand that in the Soviet system, knowledge itself was dangerous. Knowing something and not reporting it made you complicit, made you guilty. And I was trapped between my love for my son and my fear of what would happen to all of us if I stayed silent. And then the KGB came, not for him, not yet, but for me. They came to my workplace one ordinary afternoon, and they sat me down in a small room, and they asked me questions about my son, about his friends, about what I knew. And they didn't threaten me outright. They were smarter than that. They just made it clear that I had a choice. I could help them understand what my son was involved in. I could help them help him before it was too late, or I could remain silent and watch as they destroyed him anyway. Destroyed all of us. And they gave me time to think about it. They told me they would be in touch. And I walked home that day feeling like my entire body was made of glass, like one wrong step would shatter me into 1,000 pieces. And I absolutely knew that I was going to have to make a decision that would define the rest of my life, that would determine whether I was a mother who protected her child or a Soviet citizen who protected the state. And what I didn't know yet, what I couldn't possibly understand in that moment, was that there was no way to be both, no way to save him and save myself, no way to preserve the person I had been before this impossible choice was placed in front of me. And that's where you need to stay with me, because what happened next, the decision I made and the reasons I made it, that's the heart of the story. That's the moment that will make you question everything you think you know about right and wrong, about loyalty and betrayal, about what any of us would do when the people we love the most become the people we fear for the most. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when I heard the knock, not loud, not aggressive, just 3 measured taps on the door that somehow sounded more terrifying if they had been pounding. And I knew with absolute certainty who was standing on the other side. Because that's how they operated. The KGB didn't announce themselves with sirens and shouting. They came quietly, professionally, like surgeons preparing to perform an operation. And when I opened that door, I saw 2 men in. Civilian clothes, not uniforms. Never uniforms for this kind of work. And they smiled at me, actually smiled, and asked if they could come in for a conversation, just a conversation. Nothing official, nothing to worry about. And what could I say? What does anyone say when the KGB asks to come into your home at 3 a.m? So I let them in, and I watched as they sat at my kitchen table, the same table where my son and I had eaten breakfast just hours before, and they declined my offer of tea. They weren't there for pleasantries, and the taller one, the one who did most of the talking, he leaned forward and he said to me in a voice that was almost gentle, almost kind, "We know you're a good Soviet citizen. We know you love your country. We know you raised your son to be a loyal member of our society." And I felt my heart hammering in my chest because I knew what was coming next. I could feel it approaching like a storm on the horizon. And he continued, "But your son has fallen in with the wrong people, dangerous people, people who want to destroy everything we built, everything we fought for. And we need your help to save him, not to punish him, to save him. Because if you don't help us now, if you let this continue, then eventually we'll have no choice but to arrest him, to prosecute him to the full extent of Soviet law. And do you know what that means? Do you understand what happens to enemies of the state?" And I wanted to scream at them. I wanted to tell them that my son wasn't an enemy, that he was just a boy who asked questions, who read books, who wanted to understand the world. But instead I sat there frozen, paralyzed by fear, and the other man, the one who hadn't spoken yet, he pulled out a folder, thin, manila-colored, and he opened on my table, and inside were photographs of my son meeting with known dissidents, photographs of him accepting forbidden materials, photographs that proved everything they were saying, and I realized in that moment that they had been watching him for months, maybe years, that they knew everything, every meeting, every conversation, every forbidden book he had hidden in our apartment. And the tall one said, "We're not asking you to betray your son. We're asking you to save him. We're asking you to help us understand what he's involved in, so we can intervene before it's too late, before he does something that we can't protect him from." And they made it sound so reasonable, so logical, as if turning informant was an act of maternal love rather than betrayal. And then came the part that broke me, the part that I replayed in my mind 10,000 times, wondering if I could have been stronger, been braver, been different. They told me that if I didn't cooperate, if I refused to help them, then not only would my son be arrested, but my entire family would be considered suspect. My daughter, who was only 14 years old, would lose her place at the university she dreamed of attending. My husband would lose his position at the factory. We would lose our apartment, our ration cards, everything that made survival possible in the Soviet system. And they didn't say this as a threat. They said it as a fact, as an inevitable consequence of my choice. And I want you to understand something about the Soviet Union, about what it meant to be cast out, to be labeled as a family of an enemy of the state. It didn't just mean losing your job or your home. It meant becoming invisible, becoming untouchable. It meant your neighbors would stop talking to you. Stores would refuse to serve you. Doctors would turn you away. You became less than human. You became a warning to others about what happens when you step out of line. And I sat there at my kitchen table with these two men who smelled of cigarettes and aftershave, and I thought about my daughter, my beautiful girl who wanted to study medicine, who had worked so hard, who had done nothing wrong, and I thought about my husband who had served in the Great Patriotic War, who had given his youth to defending the motherland. And I thought about my son, my stubborn, idealistic, brilliant son who believed that truth was worth dying for. And I had to choose. I had to actually choose which of them to save, because the KGB had made it clear that I couldn't save them all. And they gave me 48 hours to think about it. 48 hours to decide whether I was a mother or a Soviet citizen. As if those two things could ever be separated. As if loyalty to the state and love for your child weren't fundamentally incompatible in a system that demanded absolute obedience. And after they left, I sat in my kitchen as the sun came up, and I realized that there was no right answer, no path forward that wouldn't destroy someone I loved. And I thought about running, about taking my family and fleeing. But where would we go? The borders were sealed. The Soviet Union was a prison from which there was no escape unless you were willing to risk being shot in the back as you climbed the wall. And I thought about warning my son, about telling him to stop, to destroy his books, to disappear. But I knew him. I knew he wouldn't listen. He would tell me that some things were worth fighting for even if the fight was hopeless. And so I was left with the impossible choice that the KGB had engineered for me, the choice between my son's freedom and my family's survival. between my conscience and my fear. And you have to understand that I wasn't thinking clearly. I wasn't thinking rationally. I was terrified. I was exhausted. I was convinced by their logic that if I helped them, I could somehow control the situation, somehow protect my son from the worst consequences. And that's how they do it. That's how they turn ordinary people into informants. They don't ask you to betray your loved ones. They convince you that betrayal is protection, that surveillance is care, that reporting is rescuing. And on the third night, after 48 hours of not sleeping, not eating, not being able to look my son in the eye across the dinner table, I picked up the phone, my hand shaking so badly I could barely dial the number they had given me. And when the voice answered, I heard myself say the words that would change everything, the words that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I said, I'm ready to talk. I said, I'll help you. I said, I'll tell you what you need to know. And the voice on the other end was calm, professional, unsurprised, as if they had never doubted that I would make this call. And they told me where to meet them, when to come, what to bring, and I hung up the phone and I stood there in my apartment, and I felt like I had just pushed my son off a cliff. And the worst part, the absolutely worst part that I need you to understand before we go any further, is that in that moment, I truly believed I was saving him. I truly believed that by cooperating with the KGB, I was somehow protecting my son from something worse. And it wasn't until later, much later, that I understood what I had actually done, what I had set in motion, what price my son would pay for. My fear. And that's what I need you to stay with me for. That's why you need to hear the rest of the story. Because the choice I made that night, the phone call I made in my kitchen while my family slept, that wasn't the end. That was just the beginning of a nightmare that would consume all of us. And if you think you know how this story ends, if you think you can predict what happened next, I promise you that the reality was worse, more complicated, more devastating than anything you're imagining right now. Because the KGB didn't just want information. They wanted something else. Something that would turn me into the very thing I feared most. And my son, my beautiful, idealistic son who believed in truth and freedom and justice, he was about to discover that the greatest betrayal doesn't come from your enemies. It comes from the person who loves you most in the world. They came for him at dawn exactly 6 days after I made that phone call. And I knew the moment I heard their boots on the stairs that this was my doing, that I had set this machinery in motion. And when they pushed open our apartment door without knocking, without warning, I saw my son's face in that instant before they grabbed him. And the look he gave me wasn't anger. It wasn't even surprise. It was something far worse. It was recognition. It was a sudden understanding of who had betrayed him. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw myself between him and those men. I wanted to tell him that I thought I was protecting him, that they had promised me they would go easy on him if I cooperated, that I believed them when they said this was the only way to save our family. But the words died in my throat, and I stood there like a statue while they put the handcuffs on my son and dragged him out of our home. And the last thing he said to me, the very last words my son ever spoke to me as a free man were, "Mama, how could you?" Just those 4 words. "Mama, how could you?" And then he was gone, and I collapsed on the floor of our apartment, and I understood with perfect clarity that I had just destroyed the person I loved most in this world. And here's what I need you to understand about what happened next. Here's what the KGB never told me when they were sitting at my kitchen table making their promises. They didn't just arrest my son. They destroyed him systematically, methodically, the way you dismantle a machine piece by piece. He was sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp in Kolyma, one of the most brutal camps in the entire gulag system, a place so far north, so impossibly cold that prisoners called the land of white death. And I learned later, much later, from other prisoners who survived, that my son was sent to the gold mines, where men worked 14-hour days in temperatures that dropped to 50 degrees below zero, where your breath froze in, your lungs, where your fingers and toes turned black with frostbite and had to be amputated without anesthesia, where the daily death rate was so high that bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the barracks, waiting for ground to thaw enough to bury them. And my son, my beautiful boy who had read forbidden poetry and dreamed of a better world, he lasted 3 years in that hell, 3 years of hard labor and starvation and cold that penetrated so deep into your bones that you never felt. Warm again, and then he died. He died of pneumonia combined with malnutrition and exhaustion. He died alone, thousands of miles from home, surrounded by strangers. And I didn't find out for 6 months because the camp administrators didn't bother to notify families right away. They just kept a list of the dead, and eventually someone would send a brief form letter that said your son, your husband, Your father died on such and such a date of natural causes. Natural causes. As if there was anything natural about working a human being to death in sub-zero temperatures. As if there was anything natural about a 28-year-old man dying because the state decided his thoughts were dangerous. And when I received that letter, when I held that thin piece of paper in my hands and read those bureaucratic words that told me my son was dead, I understood that I had killed him, not the KGB, not Stalin, not the system, me. I had killed my own child with a phone call, with my fear, with my belief that loyalty to the state was more important than love for my son. And I want you to know what happened to me after that. I want you to understand the price I paid for my betrayal, because this isn't a story about redemption. This is a story where the mother learns her lesson and becomes a hero. This is a story about how guilt can eat you alive from the inside out, how it can turn you into a ghost while your body still walks around. I stopped sleeping. I mean, really stopped. Because every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son's face in that moment when they took him away. Every time I tried to eat, I tasted ashes. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw a murderer, and my daughter, my 14-year-old daughter, who I had supposedly saved by turning her brother, she figured out what I had done. She put the pieces together the way children always do, and she stopped talking to me. She stopped looking at me. She moved through our apartment like I didn't exist, and when she turned 18, she left, and I never saw her again. She changed her name. She moved to another city. She erased me from her life the way you erase a mistake. And my husband, the man I had been married to for 30 years, he didn't leave me, but something in him broke, something fundamental. And we lived together in that apartment for another 20 years in almost complete silence. Two people who had lost everything that mattered. Two people who stayed together not out of love, but out of some grim sense that we deserved to suffer together. And the KGB, they never contacted me again. They got what they wanted from me, and then I was useless to them, disposable, and I realized that all their promises, all their assurances that they would help my son, that they would show leniency, that they just needed information to protect him, it was all lies. It was always lies. They knew exactly what they were doing. They knew they were going to send him to his death. And they used my love. They weaponized my maternal instinct. They turned my desire to protect my child into the instrument of his destruction, and I lived with that knowledge for 43 years. 43 years of waking up every morning and remembering that I am the woman who betrayed her son to the KGB. 43 years of watching the Soviet Union, that I had been so loyal to, that I had sacrificed my son for, slowly crumble and collapse. And when it finally fell, when the archives were opened and people could finally see the full scope of the horror, the millions of innocent people destroyed by a system that demanded absolute obedience, I felt nothing, no relief, no vindication, just emptiness, because my son was still dead and I had still killed him. And here's what I need you to take away from this story. Here's why I'm telling you this, even though it brings me no peace, no forgiveness, no redemption. Because this isn't just about me. This isn't just about one mother in the Soviet Union who made a terrible choice. This is about what happens when a system teaches you that ideology is more important than humanity, when a government convinces its citizens that betrayal is patriotism, when fear becomes so normalized that you can convince yourself that destroying the person you love most is actually an act of protection. And I want you to ask yourself, really ask yourself, could this happen to you? Could you be convinced to betray someone you love if you were scared enough? If you believed the right lies, if you thought you had no other choice, because I was just an ordinary woman. I wasn't evil. I wasn't a monster. I was just terrified and indoctrinated and trapped. And that's the most horrifying thing of all. That's what keeps me awake at night even now, decades later. The knowledge that it doesn't take a villain to commit an unforgivable act. It just takes an ordinary person in extraordinary circumstances, a person who has been taught to value the wrong things, to fear the wrong things, to believe that some abstract concept of the state or the party or the nation is worth more than the flesh and blood human being sitting across from you at the dinner table. And my son died knowing that his own mother chose the state over him. He died with that betrayal as his last memory of me. And I have to live with that. I will die with that. And there is no forgiveness for what I did, not from him, not from myself, not from history. And maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some betrayals are too fundamental, too devastating to ever be forgiven. And if you stayed with me this far, if you've listened to this whole terrible story, then you understand now why I needed to tell it, why it matters. Because somewhere right now, somewhere in the world, There's another mother being pressured to betray her child, another person being convinced that loyalty to an ideology is more important than love for another human being, and maybe if enough people understand what that path leads to, understand the devastation it causes, understand that the guilt never fades and the damage can never be undone, maybe someone will make a different choice than I did. Maybe someone will choose love over fear, humanity over ideology, and maybe one son, one daughter, one human being will be saved from the fate I condemn my child to. And that's the only meaning I can find in this nightmare, the only purpose that keeps me going, the hope that my story, my unforgivable betrayal, my 43 years of guilt and grief might prevent even one other person from making the same terrible mistake I made that night when I picked up the phone and destroyed my son's life.